こんばんは。花です。今、花のストーリータイムです。そしてこのビデオは、英語を話している人のために説明したいから、だいぶ英語で話しています。So I'm doing this video mostly in English because there are a few things I would like to explain for the English-speaking viewers. And honestly, it's about how I selected the next book I'm going to be reading. But more than just that, because as I was selecting the next book, I would go through and read the first chapter and translate it, kind of get a feel for the flow and the difficulty that I'd be working with. And each time I picked up a book and translated it, I was like, oh, this one, we are absolutely going to read this one next, only to select the next book, read that chapter, and be like, no, everything I said before was lies. I'm absolutely going to do this book next with each book that I picked up. Literature, I choose you! So what it came down to was just a few major factors, one of them being the length of the book. I didn't want to select a book that was too long, just so that we eventually would get through it in a reasonable amount of time and not get bored with the same subject, but also with the longer books, I want a bit more time to be able to translate ahead so that I can work on uploading more faster to get through those books quicker. So I'm going to save the longer ones later. Also, I did not want a book that focused on historic figures because putting where they fit in the larger context of Japanese history is really complicated and very hard to do in a clip-worthy amount of time on a video. So my decision came down to either a book about a simplified overview of Japanese history or a book about Japanese geography. Basically, where are we in Japan or when are we in Japan? And I figured, well, what's easier than Japanese geography? I mean, there are 47 prefectures. What is easier to discuss than that? Foolish mortal! So after I read and translated the first chapter and went back to that book, I realized I would have to make an introductory video to explain a few things, or at least, satisfy my nerdy inclination to over-explain things. Because you see, Japan has 47 prefectures. So simple. So innocuous. It's as just basic and forward as, oh, Japan has 4 seasons. In Pennsylvania, we have 11 seasons. Prefecture is the word we most commonly use in English to describe the regional areas of Japan. Why we use the word prefecture is based on a bit of Greek, French, and Portuguese translation. It was the word that Japan chose to use as its translation, given that it is a history of the Portuguese using the Portuguese version of prefecture based on the French and Greek use of prefects, and their areas being called prefectures, the prefect being the person who ruled over a prefecture. However, that is not the Japanese word that is used in their own language. They use the word都道府県. It's actually not a solid word. It is 4 different suffixes combined into one word. Yes, exactly like a turducken with a chicken, a duck, and a turkey, all made out of tofu. But, spoiler, 43 of those 47 prefectures in Japan only use one of those suffixes, ken. So there's to, do, fu, and ken. So there's these 4 little snowflake regions that use the other 3 of to, do, and fu. But why? Because there weren't always 47 prefectures. Japan has a long history. Originally, they weren't thought of as governmental prefectures, but used to be more like kind of fiefdoms. Clans, not to be confused with clams, controlled different regions and had different names based on the clan name or the family name, or even as much as based on a regional distinctive feature. Since, might makes right, land and power were fought over, power being the ability to yell at the peasants to work harder and pay more taxes, until a relative peace was established, kill everybody who disagrees, in about the 1600s. Borders were stabilized, relative peace was there, and place names became codified. Bureaucracy thrived and expanded and grew more dense layers than you could ever hope to imagine. Then everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. No, I mean when foreign ships skipped the full mandatory stop in southern Japan and rolled right up to the front door of eastern Japan in 1853 and kicked down the Do Not Disturb sign on that door. Except, you know, with more politics and time involved. For the massive amounts of then fighting and state building that occurred, power was transferred from military-based lords ruling over their lands to government bodies that administered the will of the emperor. But government is expensive, and all of those layers of bureaucracy that had built up before became a lot to maintain. And you know what saves the government money? Consolidation! So since the naming conventions of some areas were not exactly universal at the time, as everything was in flux, some metropolitan areas were given the suffix of fu. There's about 9 of them. There were these large areas, and they were surrounded by other areas that were given the label of ken. Eventually, those 9 metropolitan areas reduced to 3, of which 2 of them still retain the suffix fu, which are Kyoto and Osaka. Can you guess the third one? Stay tuned, you'll find out at the end of this explanation. Hokkaido, however, was not considered entirely Japanese until this massive change in the later 1800s and was more governmentally annexed. There had always been incursions into the land before that, but different story. And it eventually was broken into 3 prefectures, which was then consolidated down to 1 just a few short years later, but with several subregions in it. Call now to get your very own consolidated government with new, fewer government administrative resources. So about 6 other regions in Japan use the do suffix, but Hokkaido was not one of them originally because, again, so far north, it's this other land up there. But now the do is part of Hokkaido, and it just became part of the name. Do came to join the gang of suffixes that just meant, well, prefecture. So it's kind of like saying Hokkai prefecture, but you know, northern sea road. Totally. No, that's it. The last one to become its own administrative zone was Tokyo. 5 points if you guessed it right. Thanks to World War II and a lot of other territories Japan was overseeing at the time. No, we don't have time for that. No. Tokyo was seen as its own unique, highly populated region and changed its designation from fu to to because it was super special like that. Now, in pre-World War II documents, you can often see it referred to as Tokyo Fu. It's just a bureaucratic name, not a martial arts style. Oh, and another pedantic note. Regional directions. North and south seem pretty easy to identify in Japan, but there's the slight problem that Japan doesn't run in a straight line from south to north, which makes the whole east-west part a little bit trickier. Screw you map makers, you get a rectangle to put it in. Figure it out! It's not just Pacific Ocean side versus Sea of Japan or East Asian Sea side, however you're going to call it. We're going to call it Sea of Japan because it's Japanese-based learning, and they call it that. Again, not getting into that one right now. For a long time, northeastern Japan was of less consequence to the entangled politics, and so much of Japanese history played out on that west-east axis of Japan. In fact, the very name for Tokyo is Eastern Capital, and even that was considered this distant outpost of, the central area. Don't get me wrong, lots of cool stuff was happening further north, and in terms of, who killed who, that was happening more closer to the emperor's seat in Kyoto. Much more poetry involved. So, southern Japan is fairly obvious, but then it starts kind of running east before taking a turn at Albuquerque and heading north again. And just like telling history is based on point of view, Japanese civilization is seen as spreading from Kyushu and up to the east. Forget the natives who took the northern land bridge and spread south. No. So with that oversimplified explanation, and probably a mistake or two I missed in there, like forgotten Easter eggs on a summer day, I can now get into reading this book that should be easy enough for a child to understand, given that child was raised in Japan. So, as always, everyone, thank you. Let's enjoy a new book, and remember, 物語を読んで、物語を言って、物語を楽しんでくださいね。So, everybody read stories, tell stories, and enjoy stories. Bye. Japan was seen as its own kind of unique, highly populated region, and it's changed its... Tokyo was seen as its own unique, highly populated region, and changed... I can't words today.